What would you do if the wildest animal you'd ever seen walked straight into your life? Not with teeth bared, but with eyes begging for trust. That's how it started for Michael Harris and his 8-year-old son, Eli, on a fog-thick morning that felt different even before the sun burned off the chill. Michael was up first, the way widowers often are, chasing sleep he can't catch. He padded downstairs in heavy socks, the floorboards groaning under memories. The farmhouse kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and a distant, ragged sound he couldn't place, somewhere between a baby's cry and a wild animal's yowl. Eli's small feet slapped the stairs behind him. He was already dressed, wearing the same blue sweatshirt 3 days running, blonde hair tangled from restless dreams. "Dad, do you hear that?" Michael nodded, concern blooming in his chest. "Let's check the barn. Cooper might be into something." Cooper was their old golden retriever, gentle as rain, but lately grieving too. His own litter of puppies had been born just last week in the hayloft. Michael grabbed his boots. Eli slipped on battered sneakers, and together they hurried out into the dewy air. The barn stood like a tired sentinel at the edge of the property, paint peeling, doors gaping, but full of life. Rats, birds, and as they'd soon find out, something far wilder. The yowling grew louder as they stepped inside, noses filled with the sharp scent of straw and old leather. Sunbeams knifed through cracks in the wood, illuminating dust motes and the tangled shapes of Cooper's bedding. The dog was there, but instead of his usual lazy sprawl, he sat up rigid, head cocked, eyes fixed on a dark corner near the base of a hay bale. Eli pointed, whispering, "Look, Dad. Over there." Michael crouched, motioning Eli behind him. He saw her then, a bobcat, not much bigger than Cooper, but twice as wild. Her coat was mottled gold and gray, tufted ears sharp as switchblades, eyes like molten amber. She was pressed against the wall, breathing hard. 3 tiny kittens curled at her belly. A raw, desperate edge colored her gaze, but she did not run. The barn seemed to shrink around them, every sound magnified. Michael's heart hammered. His instinct was to back away, grab Eli, call animal control, but something in the animal's eyes made him freeze. It wasn't just fear, it was a dare. The bobcat was making a silent deal. She would trust them, for now, if they trusted her. Cooper whined low in his throat, his tail thumping once. The bobcat didn't flinch. Instead, she simply stared, as if measuring their worth. The kittens, eyes still closed, kneaded her fur, oblivious to the humans standing only feet away. Eli's hand found Michael's. "Is she going to hurt Cooper?" Michael shook his head, more certain than he felt. "I don't think so. She could have already if she wanted." He watched as the bobcat's breathing slowed, her body relaxing just a fraction. A flash of movement. Cooper shuffled closer, sniffing the air. The 2 mothers, canine and feline, locked eyes, a universe of loss and hope passing between them. Cooper's own puppies squirmed in the next stall, soft mewling rising up like a chorus. Michael knew the risks. A wild bobcat this close to the house? Every neighbor would have a fit. But if she wasn't running, neither would he. The barn, for this fragile moment, became a sanctuary, an invisible line drawn between the world outside and the world within. He knelt, never breaking eye contact. "We're not going to hurt you," he said softly, voice trembling. "We'll keep you safe, all of you." For the next hour, Michael and Eli watched, holding their breath as the boundaries between wild and tame blurred. The barn cats slunk in the rafters, restless, sensing the shift in power. Cooper lay down, stretching his body between his puppies and the bobcat's kittens, not as a guard, but as a bridge. Eli, wide-eyed, whispered stories to the kittens, his voice carrying over the hush. Michael tried to memorize every detail, the sheen of the bobcat's coat, the rise and fall of her chest, the tiny, blind faces nestled at her side. At one point, the bobcat lifted her head, scanning Michael as if reading his soul. For a heartbeat, Michael felt the weight of her trust settle on his shoulders, terrifying and sacred. Outside, the morning grew louder, a tractor down the road, crows arguing in the trees, but inside that barn, time stretched and held. Michael understood, with a clarity that cut through his grief, that they were witnessing something rare, the birth of an accidental family, woven together by chance and choice. The bobcat, Eli later named her Sable, closed her eyes and sighed, surrendering, just for now, to safety. Michael squeezed his son's hand. "Looks like we've got new roommates, buddy." Eli grinned, missing his front tooth, hope bright in his eyes. "Can we keep them?" "We'll see," Michael said, heart pounding, already knowing the answer. For the first time in months, he felt something new flicker in his chest, a wild, stubborn hope. And outside, the world waited, unaware that everything had just changed. It didn't take long for word to get out. In a small town like Morgan's Hollow, secrets have a way of leaking through the cracks faster than water in spring. By lunchtime, Michael had already fielded 2 phone calls, one from old Mrs. Watts, whose chickens roamed a little too close to the property line, and one from Pete Johnson, whose stories about wild animals grew taller with every retelling. "You got a bobcat in your barn?" Pete's voice came through the crackly phone line, equal parts disbelief and accusation. "Mike, I hope you know what you're doing. That animal's gonna bring trouble. Mark my words." Michael, half listening as he watched Eli play in the yard with Cooper, kept his tone calm. "She's not hurting anybody, Pete. She's just trying to raise her babies. We're keeping our distance." "That's not how wild things work, Mike. You give 'em an inch. Next thing you know, they're taking your chickens, your dog, maybe even your kid." Michael gripped the phone, glancing toward the barn. "She's got no interest in chickens or trouble. Just let us be, will you?" He hung up, a knot forming in his gut. Warnings and rumors drifted like smoke over the fields. He knew how quickly a story could twist, how a wild mother and her kittens could turn from marvel to menace in the eyes of people who didn't understand. But inside the barn, something remarkable was happening. Cooper, for all his lumbering sadness, was a gentle soul. He had lost his mate 2 months earlier, and his puppies were all the family he had left. Yet even with Sable, the bobcat, just feet away, Cooper showed no sign of fear. If anything, he seemed curious, almost protective. Each morning, Sable left before the sun crested the trees, slipping through a crack in the boards, gone for hours at a time. Michael watched her one dawn, sleek and silent as she melted into the brush, every muscle rippling beneath her fur. He wondered where she went, what hunger or danger drove her, and what it meant for her to trust them enough to leave her helpless kittens behind. Cooper, never one to let a young creature cry, began visiting Sable's litter after she left. At first, it was just a cautious sniff, a gentle nudge of a wayward kitten back toward the warmth of the hay. The puppies, 5 in all, chubby and noisy, were curious too. At first, Michael worried. Could this go wrong? Would instincts snap and ruin everything? But slowly, a strange kind of peace settled in. Cooper would lie down, forming a wall of fur and heat, and the bobcat kittens would curl against him, purring so softly it was almost inaudible. The puppies, after some initial confusion, accepted the newcomers with the easy generosity of youth, snuffling and whining and occasionally clambering over their feline cousins. Eli was the first to notice. One afternoon, after a rainstorm had washed the world clean, he slipped into the barn and gasped, "Dad, you gotta see this!" Michael hurried inside, expecting chaos, but what he saw instead took his breath away. Cooper sprawled on his side, eyes half closed, with a puppy tucked against his chest and a tiny bobcat kitten draped over his neck. The rest of the litters were tangled together like a pile of mismatched socks, puppies and kittens, wild and tame, heartbeat to heartbeat. Eli grinned, hugging himself with excitement. "They're friends, Dad. Cooper's babysitting all of them." Michael knelt beside the hay, awe prickling his skin. He knew nature didn't always play fair. He'd seen enough heartbreak for one lifetime. But here, in this fragile truce, was something he'd never imagined. A blended family, stitched together by necessity and grace. It wasn't always easy. Some days, Sable returned to find her kittens tangled up with floppy puppies, and she'd let out a low, warning growl. Cooper would stand his ground, tail wagging, and the two parents would size each other up, a contest of wills, never violence, but never quite trust either. Sometimes, Sable vanished for a full day, anxiety tightening Michael's chest until he heard her padded footsteps at dusk. Each time she brought something back. A mouse, a rabbit, once even a fish from the creek. She dropped her catch near the kittens, then curled around them, her body a living shield. The barn, once echoing with emptiness, now throbbed with the noise and scent of new life. But even as the days grew brighter, Michael sensed the tension outside their sanctuary. Neighbors slowed their trucks as they passed. A sheriff's cruiser parked at the end of the drive one afternoon, the deputy peering toward the barn with suspicion. Michael waved, forcing a smile, determined to protect the fragile peace he'd found. One evening, a new kind of fear crept in. A puppy, a bold little male Eli called Finn, wandered too close to Sable's litter. The bobcat stiffened, a warning rumble in her throat. Michael, frozen in the doorway, waited for the worst. But Cooper trotted over, nosing Finn back to the right side of the hay, and Sable's fur settled. The crisis passed, but the line between wild and tame was thinner than ever. As dusk settled over the fields, Michael found himself sitting in the barn, watching as the animals fell asleep in a heap of fur and tiny snores. Eli sat beside him, stroking a kitten, his own worries melting away. "Do you think they'll stay friends forever?" Eli whispered. Michael smiled, knowing the world would find a way to test them. "I don't know, buddy. But for now, we let them teach us." As darkness wrapped the barn, Michael closed his eyes, praying that trust, so fragile and rare, would be enough to keep them all safe, at least one more night. Days passed, measured not by the ticking of clocks, but by the shifting rhythm of the barn. Summer crept in, painting the grass a deeper green, the sun pressing through the open loft window in fat golden stripes. If the outside world whispered warnings and gossiped at fences, inside that barn a fragile peace kept growing roots. Michael had always been a quiet man, shaped by years of labor and loss. Since his wife's death, he'd carried grief like an extra limb, heavy and invisible, always in the way. But now something was changing. He started waking not just out of habit, but out of hope. A curious itch to see what the day would bring. And always, before he made coffee or checked the weather, he checked the barn. Each morning, he found the animals tangled together in a muddled, beautiful mess. Cooper, the wise old retriever, lay on his side, puppies and bobcat kittens forming a living blanket across his back and belly. Sable, the bobcat, would return at dawn, her fur dusted with dew, nose twitching at the scents of night. She'd pause, studying Michael, her yellow eyes flickering with calculation, then step delicately over Cooper's tail to reach her kittens. One morning, Michael caught himself laughing as he watched a puppy, Finn, clumsily try to mimic a bobcat's pounce. The little dog tumbled into a heap of hay, tail wagging, while one of Sable's kittens arched her back and hissed, then promptly tumbled over herself. Eli, watching from his perch on a bale, clapped his hands. "They're learning from each other, Dad. That one thinks he's a cat." Michael grinned, ruffling Eli's hair. "Or maybe the kitten thinks she's a dog. Either way, I think we're outnumbered." He kept his camera close, taking photos of the odd, blended family. The shots were shaky at first. He didn't want to startle Sable. But soon she seemed to accept his presence, eyes half closed as he moved around the stall. Sometimes Michael spoke softly to her, almost as if she might answer. "You trust us, don't you? At least a little." She never made a sound in reply, but her actions spoke louder than any words. When Eli snuck in one afternoon, cradling a book about wild animals, Sable let him sit just feet away from her and the kittens. Eli's mother had loved animals too, and Michael watched his son reading aloud, voice gentle and bright, while Sable's ears flicked in quiet attention. The wall between loss and new life was slowly, steadily coming down. Yet the trust between wild and tame was a slow dance, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sable never let her guard down completely. If a barn cat strayed too close or a loud noise shattered the peace, she'd rise to her feet, tail twitching, ready to defend her brood. Cooper, ever patient, would step between them, a living truce. No growling, just quiet assurance. One rainy evening, Michael came in to find Eli curled up with a puppy and a bobcat kitten, reading in the pale light of a lantern. Sable lounged nearby, eyes half shut, clearly listening. The old barn felt less like a building and more like a sanctuary, a place where grief didn't vanish, but softened and made room for awe. Michael's heart ached sometimes, watching Eli with the animals. The boy had lost so much. At first, Michael had feared the wildness, the risk of hurt, the pain of letting his son get close to something that might leave. But Eli seemed to need this strange family just as much as the animals did. Where words failed, the warmth of a puppy, the rough tongue of a kitten, filled the space. One afternoon, Michael found Sable grooming Cooper's head, quick licks that bordered on affection. Cooper, eyes droopy, accepted the attention without complaint. Even the barn cats seemed confused, lurking in the shadows but never daring to interfere. Sometimes Michael let himself imagine a future where this fragile peace could last. But shadows lingered on the edges of every day. Rumors in town, the distant crack of a hunter's rifle, the knowledge that wild and tame are not meant to blend forever. Still, he clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, the barn had become a place where lines could blur, where trust could win out over instinct. Eli, for his part, bloomed in the company of the animals. He grew bolder, laughter coming more easily. He stopped flinching at shadows, started asking questions about the world outside their little farm. Michael watched his son learning to care, to trust, to forgive. Not just the animals, but himself. On warm nights, after chores were done, Michael and Eli would sit on the porch, the barn door open to the soft sounds within. Crickets chirped, and fireflies blinked in the tall grass. Michael sometimes shared stories about Eli's mother, how she'd once rescued an injured crow, how she'd insisted wildness was just another word for freedom. Eli would listen, then say, "Mom would have loved this, wouldn't she? The kittens and puppies together." Michael's throat tightened, but he smiled. "Yeah, buddy, she would have called it a miracle." He meant it too. Each day, the slow dance of trust drew them closer, weaving a new family out of broken pieces and second chances. Sometimes at dusk, Sable would lift her head and watch Michael through the fading light. For a long moment, Wild and Tame would meet, not as enemies, but as partners in a strange, beautiful bargain, one that neither truly understood, but both chose every day to honor. As June ripened into July, the barn became a classroom for lessons no book could teach. The kitten's eyes had opened to a world that was neither all wild nor all tame, but something strange and in between. The puppies grew bold and round, their legs sturdy, their voices a chorus that bounced off the dusty rafters. The days blurred together in a gentle cycle of feeding, playing, and the slow but sure weaving of trust. Sable, the wild bobcat, became both a shadow and a guardian. She began leaving her kittens for longer stretches at a time, slipping out before dawn and returning with the night air tangled in her fur and the scent of the woods heavy on her breath. She hunted for her family, sometimes dragging in a half-grown rabbit or a squirrel, sometimes returning with nothing but weariness in her eyes. Michael watched her closely. He saw how motherhood sharpened and softened her all at once, her movements fierce and economical, her gaze tender as she groomed her babies, her patience infinite, even as she stayed forever on alert. But it was Cooper, the golden retriever, who surprised everyone most. He stepped into the gap that Sable left, becoming an unlikely stand-in for both litters. He licked each kitten clean, nuzzled the smallest puppy when it whined, and kept a watchful eye for barn cats or crows bold enough to swoop low. Eli, ever the observer, noticed how Cooper would round up the wandering kittens and nudge them gently back into the hay with the others, his eyes full of quiet pride. Michael marveled at Cooper's transformation. The old dog, who once barely left his bed after losing his mate, now took up the mantle of protector with newfound purpose. When Sable returned from the woods, she never bristled at Cooper's presence anymore. Instead, she would touch noses with him, sometimes curling up on the far side of the nest while he kept vigil on the other. Michael watched the two, an uneasy alliance forged by circumstance and deepened by need. One afternoon, the lesson in wildness arrived unexpectedly. Eli, who had become so comfortable among the animals, had started reaching for the kittens as soon as he entered the barn. That day, as sunlight streamed through the slats, one of Sable's kittens, a gray male with streaks of cinnamon along his back, darted between Eli's feet. Eli, excited, reached out, and the kitten, cornered and unsure, bit him lightly on the back of his hand. Eli yelped and pulled away, startled more than hurt. Michael hurried over, examining the small bite. A few drops of blood welled up, bright against the pale skin. "Dad, he bit me. Did I do something wrong?" Michael took a steadying breath, pressing a clean rag to Eli's hand. "You startled him, buddy. He's still wild. It's not his fault, and it's not yours either. He just doesn't know you're a friend yet." Eli's eyes filled with tears. Fear and shame mingled. Michael sat him on a bale of hay and wrapped his arm around his son. "This is what it means to care for wild things. Sometimes they get scared. Sometimes they need space. You can't tame everything. We have to respect their boundaries, even if we want to help." Eli sniffled, nodding. Cooper sat at his feet, licking his knee as if to reassure him. Sable watched from across the barn, her gaze sharp and unreadable. Later, Michael cleaned and bandaged Eli's hand in the kitchen. He explained again, gently, about wildness and respect. "We're guests in their world, not the other way around," he said. "We help where we can, but we don't try to change what they are. That evening, as twilight painted the fields in shades of lavender and blue, Sable returned. She moved straight to Eli, sniffing his bandaged hand. The boy froze, wide-eyed, but Sable just brushed her head against his knee, a brief, rough gesture that could almost be mistaken for a thank you. Then, to Michael's amazement, she crossed to Cooper and nuzzled him gently, a silent acknowledgement of all he had done. Michael felt something shift inside him, a knot of anxiety unraveling. The animals were teaching them as much as they were being cared for. He understood that real trust was slow, built with patience and setbacks, not grand gestures. That night, Michael found himself lying awake, replaying the events in his mind. In his grief, he'd sometimes wondered if his heart could ever open again. But watching Cooper with the young and Sable learning to let go, even a little, he felt the walls around his own sorrow softening. Maybe there was more room in life for wildness and unpredictability than he'd once believed. The days that followed were quieter, but no less rich. Eli learned to move more slowly around the animals, to offer his hand instead of grabbing, to let the kittens come to him on their own terms. He wore his bandage like a badge, and Michael noticed how Sable seemed to linger a little longer each night, watching Eli with new, cautious curiosity. One evening, as the barn glowed with the last golden light, Michael sat with his son and watched Cooper gather the puppies and kittens into a sleepy pile. Sable lounged nearby, her body curled protectively, but no longer tense. For a few moments, all was quiet, but for the sound of breathing and the wind in the rafters. Eli leaned against his father, drowsy and content. "I think I like wild things, Dad, even when they bite." Michael smiled, brushing the hair from Eli's forehead. "Me too, buddy. Me too." For that moment, the lessons of motherhood, patience, letting go, accepting what cannot be changed, echoed through the barn, stronger than any storm or sorrow. And as the stars blinked awake outside, Michael felt hope settle over them all, as soft and real as a mother's touch. Summer in Morgan's Hollow was a study in contrasts. Sun-washed mornings thick with birdsong, shadows stretching long and cool beneath ancient trees. But as July deepened, a tension crept into the air, prickling at the back of Michael's neck, making him check the barn doors twice at dusk and keep his shotgun, long neglected, closer than usual. The warning came quietly at first. One afternoon, while Michael was restacking firewood by the porch, Pete Johnson showed up in his battered Ford, dust trailing like a flag behind him. He cut the engine and leaned out the window, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his sweat-stained hat. "Heard some folks seen hunters out by the timberline," Pete said, voice low. "They're not just after deer this time of year. A few of them were asking about bobcats." Michael stiffened, trying not to show it. "There's always hunters out that way. Nothing new." Pete shook his head. "Sheriff's been around. Says if any wildcats caught near livestock or too close to town, they'll call animal control. You know how this town is. Folks get scared. They don't ask questions first." Michael forced a smile, but his mind was racing. "I'll keep an eye out, Pete. Appreciate the heads up." After Pete left, Michael walked the fence line, eyes scanning the woods. The barn seemed to pulse with secrets, the life inside it growing more precious with every rumor. He told himself he wouldn't let fear rule him, but he couldn't ignore the dread threading through his thoughts. That night, Michael shared the news with Eli over dinner, keeping his voice light. "We might need to be extra careful with our visitors in the barn. People are starting to talk." Eli, fork hovering over his mashed potatoes, frowned. "Are they going to take Sable away?" Michael hesitated. Not if we can help it. But we have to be careful. She's still wild, and some folks don't understand. After dinner, they made the rounds together. In the barn, Cooper was already herding the puppies and kittens into the safest corner of the hayloft. Sable, senses sharpened by years of surviving in the wild, seemed agitated, her ears flicking at every sound, her movements tense. The animals picked up on the mood too, restlessness rippling through the young ones. Even the barn cats kept to the shadows, as if sensing the storm gathering beyond the walls. That evening, the sky grew heavy with thunderheads. Michael kept the barn door unlatched in case Sable needed to come and go, but he worried about the woods, about what might be lurking in the dark. When the first fat drops of rain hit the tin roof, Eli squeezed Michael's hand tight. "Will the animals be safe, Dad?" "We're doing everything we can, kiddo," Michael whispered. "We just have to trust them, and each other." A hard rain fell for hours, rattling the barn, drumming out any chance of sleep. Michael found himself standing in the doorway, flashlight in hand, scanning the yard for movement. The wind whipped across the fields, carrying the distant echo of gunshots. Maybe from the hunters, maybe just thunder, but every sound made Michael's heart stutter. After midnight, as the storm raged, Sable slipped away. She vanished so silently, not even Cooper noticed until she was gone. The barn felt emptier, the darkness heavier. The puppies whined, pressing close to Cooper, while the Bobcat kittens paced the edge of the nest, eyes wide, ears flat. The uneasy truce of the last few weeks suddenly felt more fragile than ever. Then, just before dawn, the worst happened. Michael, half asleep in a kitchen chair, was jolted awake by frantic barking. Cooper was pawing at the back door, nose pressed to the glass, whining with a panic Michael had never seen before. Eli, still in pajamas, raced down the hall. Together they rushed into the storm-damp barn. The scene was chaos, hay scattered, tiny paw prints stamped into the wet floor. Cooper's puppies were huddled in a tight, trembling group, but Finn, the boldest puppy, was missing. Sable's kittens clung together, but Michael's eyes quickly counted only two. "Where's Ash?" Eli cried, voice breaking. "Where's Finn?" Michael's mind spun. He checked every corner of the barn, calling out softly, searching for any sign of the missing young. The storm had flung the doors wide, and in the distance trees still shivered from the night's violence. Panic clawed at his chest. 2 young lives, one wild, one tame, lost somewhere in the woods. The fear in Eli's eyes cut deep. "Dad, we have to find them, please!" Michael knelt, gripping his son's shoulders. "We will, but we have to be smart. Let's get Cooper. He knows their scent." Cooper, frantic but determined, sniffed the ground, tail high, ready to lead the search. Michael grabbed his jacket and a flashlight, Eli pulling boots over bare feet. The rain had slowed, but the world outside was slick and treacherous. They followed Cooper out into the storm-drenched woods, branches whipping at their legs, hearts pounding. Each step into the darkness felt like a step into the unknown, fear and hope battling inside them. Back at the barn, the rest of the animals huddled together, waiting. The sanctuary they'd built now felt haunted by the possibility of loss, every shadow whispering of danger. Michael pressed on, the image of Finn and Ash, one puppy, one kitten, neither truly belonging to the wild or the tame, burned into his mind. Behind him, Eli stumbled, but refused to turn back. "We can't give up, Dad. We have to find them. We're their family." As they plunged deeper into the woods, rain washing away old tracks, Michael realized just how much had changed. The line between wild and home had blurred. These animals weren't just guests anymore. They were family, and family, no matter how fragile, was worth any risk. Ahead, Cooper barked, the sound urgent and sharp. A sign, or maybe just a prayer, calling lost ones home through the darkness. The woods behind Michael's farmhouse had always been a place of mystery, a thick patchwork of pines and underbrush, crisscrossed by animal trails and old, forgotten fencing. But that morning, just after the storm, the woods felt like something else entirely, a living labyrinth swallowing sound and hope. Every tree, every thicket seemed to press in, hiding secrets, and, maybe, just maybe, the two missing young Michael and Eli had come to love. Cooper led the way, nose to the ground, golden fur dark with rain. His focus was laser-sharp, the urgency in every step. Michael gripped the flashlight, breath clouding in the damp morning air, while Eli followed close, boots squelching in the mud. The fear in Eli's eyes was raw, a silent plea that Michael felt in his bones. He squeezed his son's shoulder. "We'll find them, Eli. Cooper's got them. We just have to trust." They pressed deeper, the world narrowing to the crunch of undergrowth and the frantic pattern of Cooper's barks. Here and there, Michael spotted signs. A paw print half filled with rainwater, a snag of fur on a low branch. The search felt endless, the cold biting through every layer, but neither father nor son let up. Suddenly, Cooper's bark changed, sharper, insistent. He bounded ahead, tail high, and disappeared behind a stand of blackberry brambles. Michael and Eli crashed after him, adrenaline burning away the fatigue. Beyond the brambles, in a hollow where the storm had blown branches into a tangled nest, they found Sable. She was crouched low, every muscle tense, her breath coming in quick, ragged bursts. In her jaws, clenched but gentle, she carried Finn, the missing puppy, his golden fur plastered to his little body, eyes wide but unharmed. At her side, Ash, the wildest of her kittens, shivered, soaking wet but alive. Eli gasped, relief breaking through in a cry. "Finn! Ash!" Sable's eyes flashed, wary, desperate, but not hostile. She laid Finn carefully on the ground and nudged Ash closer. Michael stepped forward, heart pounding, hands raised. "It's okay, Sable. We're here to help." For a moment, time froze. Sable's instincts warred within her. Flee or fight, trust or retreat. But then Cooper stepped into the clearing, tail wagging, and barked softly. Sable looked from Cooper to Michael, and something unspoken passed between them. A mutual understanding, earned through days and nights of uneasy alliance. Michael knelt in the mud, reaching for Finn. Sable tensed, but didn't move. Slowly, carefully, Michael scooped the puppy into his arms. Finn licked his chin, tail wagging in a tremulous burst of relief. Eli crouched, arms outstretched. Ash hesitated, fur bristling, but then let himself be gathered up, pressing into Eli's chest with a plaintive mew. Tears welled in Eli's eyes, spilling over as he whispered, "You're safe. You're really safe." Thunder rumbled far off, the storm finally moving on. For a minute, the clearing was filled with nothing but the sound of breathing and the soft cries of the rescued. Sable slumped, exhausted, head low, as if the weight of the whole world had pressed down on her slender shoulders. Michael brushed mud from his jeans, cradling Finn close. He looked at Sable and said quietly, "Thank you. You saved him." Sable blinked, her eyes not wild, but weary. She moved to Cooper, pressing her nose to his ear, and then, startling Michael, she gave him a rough, grateful nuzzle. The old retriever licked her muzzle in return, as if sealing a pact that went beyond words, beyond instinct. The journey back to the barn was slow and careful. Eli held Ash wrapped in his jacket, murmuring comfort. Michael carried Finn, feeling the puppy's heartbeat steady against his chest. Cooper and Sable walked side by side, two parents, One wild, one tame, sharing a hard-won trust. When they reached the barn, the world seemed to exhale. The rest of the puppies and kittens yipped and mewled, crowding around their lost siblings in a flurry of wagging tails and tiny purrs. Sable checked each kitten, licking their faces, then curled up in the hay, finally able to rest. Cooper herded the puppies into a warm heap, nosing Finn into the center, and lay down with a tired groan. Michael and Eli slumped on a bale of hay, every muscle aching, but every fear eased. For the first time since the storm, the barn felt like a haven again, a patch of light in the shadow of uncertainty. That night, as rain tapped softly on the tin roof, the family, awed, fragile, and bound by trust, huddled together for warmth. Eli, still in muddy clothes, refused to leave the barn. He curled beside Cooper and the animals, face soft in the lantern's glow. Michael sat nearby, heart swelling with a fierce pride and gratitude. He watched Sable as she drifted to sleep, her sides rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Cooper, half awake, kept one eye on the barn door, but his tail thumped with each slow breath. Michael realized that the boundaries he once clung to, between wild and home, risk and safety, had blurred into something entirely new. Later, as he tucked Eli into bed, Michael knelt at his son's side. "You were brave today," he said. "You didn't give up." Eli looked up, eyes shining. Neither did Sable or Cooper. "We're all family, right? Even the wild parts." Michael nodded, tears prickling at his eyes. "Yeah, bud. Even the wild parts." Outside, the storm had passed. In the barn, the strange, beautiful family, dog, Bobcat, children, and the young they protected, slept side by side. Their trust hard-earned, their bond unbreakable. For now, at least, they were safe. And in that fragile, flickering peace, Michael let himself hope. For all of them. By the time the sun had dried the last puddles from the storm, news of the barn's strange inhabitants had swept across Morgan's Hollow like wildfire. There were rumors, embellished at every stop, of a bobcat raising her kittens side by side with a dog and his puppies, of children playing among wild things, and of Michael Harris losing his mind out at the old farm. The first knock came early, just as Michael was pouring coffee, still shaking off the exhaustion from the night before. Through the window, he saw Pete Johnson and Mrs. Watts standing on the porch, their faces set with a worried purpose. Behind them, a few more neighbors lingered near their trucks, arms crossed, waiting to see if the stories were true. Michael braced himself and opened the door. "Morning, folks. Everything all right?" Mrs. Watts wasted no time. "Michael, we need to talk about that bobcat. People are scared. What if it comes after our pets? Or our kids?" Pete nodded. "We've seen Cooper out there with her, and the whole town's buzzing. Some folks are saying you're putting us all in danger." Michael took a slow breath, steadying himself. "Sable isn't a threat. She's just a mother doing her best. She's never attacked anyone. Cooper and the kids are fine. In fact, better than fine. Something amazing is happening in that barn." Pete frowned, glancing at the others gathering behind him. "Amazing or not, you can't expect people to be okay with a wild animal that close to home." Before Michael could answer, the barn door creaked open and Eli appeared, hair sticking up, cradling Ash the bobcat kitten in his arms. The crowd gasped. Mrs. Watts stepped back. One of the younger men raised his phone, filming as if hoping for a viral moment. Eli's voice was clear, unwavering. "They're our friends. Sable's never hurt us. She trusts us, and we trust her." For a second, nobody spoke. Michael saw the fear and fascination battling in their faces, the old story of us versus them playing out right there on his porch. He squared his shoulders. "I know it's hard to believe, but what's happening here, it's rare. Cooper and Sable have made peace. The young are growing up together. We're watching something special, not dangerous. A murmur went through the crowd. Some seemed moved, others unconvinced. Mrs. Watts pursed her lips. Michael, I know you're hurting. We all miss Mary. But letting wild animals mix with your boy, maybe you're not thinking straight. Michael's hands shook, but he refused to let anger show. Maybe grief changes what you see, or maybe it makes you notice things you missed before. Either way, I'm not putting anyone in danger. I'm protecting a family, mine and hers. Suddenly, Cooper trotted into the yard, tail wagging, a puppy and a kitten trailing after him. The sight was so surreal that Pete chuckled despite himself. I'll be damned. They really are together. As the crowd watched, Cooper flopped down in the grass, Sable's kittens and his puppies tumbling over him, forming a furry, wriggling mound of trust. Even the most skeptical neighbor couldn't miss the gentleness, the comfort these animals shared. One of the younger women, Tasha from the diner, stepped forward, phone still rolling. Can I take a picture? Eli grinned. Sure, just be slow. They're still a little shy. That small act changed the energy on the porch. A few others lowered their arms, curiosity slowly winning out over fear. Michael invited everyone to the barn, where he explained how Sable only came at night, how the animals slept together, how there had never been a scratch or a growl out of place. Word spread. Cooper became a minor celebrity, his story whispered at the grocery store, posted on social media, even written up in the local paper. The headline read, Dog and Bobcat forge unlikely truce on Harris Farm. Pictures of Cooper cuddling Sable's kittens made their way across the county, drawing visitors, skeptics, and reporters. But not everyone was convinced. The sheriff returned, this time with a wildlife officer in tow. They stood in Michael's kitchen, hats in hand, voices low but firm. Mr. Harris, we have to be careful. There are rules about keeping wild animals. If Sable causes trouble, we'll have no choice but to remove her. Michael met their eyes, calm and resolute. She's free. She comes and goes. If she wanted trouble, she'd have brought it by now. All I ask is that you let her be. The officer considered this. We'll keep an eye on things, but if the town keeps pushing, our hands might be tied. As they left, Michael watched Sable's shadow dart along the tree line, watchful but unafraid. He knew the fragile peace could break with a single incident, a single moment of fear. But for now, the story was out, and most of the town was rooting for them. Some neighbors brought gifts, blankets for the barn, treats for Cooper. Tasha started calling Cooper the peacemaker, and folks came to see the miracle with their own eyes. Eli basked in the new attention, telling the story of Sable's trust and Cooper's gentleness to anyone who would listen. That week, the barn was busier than ever. Children from town sat quietly, eyes wide, as Sable's kittens played beside the puppies. Parents stood close, cautious but curious, witnessing the rare peace. Michael answered questions, shared coffee, and watched the boundaries between wild and human, fear and wonder blur just a little more with every new visitor. Still, he never stopped watching the woods, never forgot that trust is always on trial. He warned Eli, it only takes one mistake, one moment, and this could all change. But for now, as dusk settled and Sable returned to her young, the barn was a beacon, a place where impossible things happened, where hope and fear sat side by side, waiting to see what would come next. The week the blizzard came, it was as if the world itself decided to test the little family's resolve. The winds swept down from the north with a fury that rattled every window in the old farmhouse and turned the fields to a churning, white ocean. For days, the town was paralyzed. Roads buried, power lines snapped, the world outside reduced to a muffled blur of white and wind. Inside the barn, warmth became a precious commodity. Michael stuffed every crack in the wood with burlap and hay. He brought old quilts from the attic, draping them over makeshift beds where the puppies and kittens huddled. Pressed so close together you couldn't tell where fur ended and shivering bodies began. Cooper never left their side, curling himself into a living shield, his breath and heartbeat keeping them alive when the night grew colder than memory. Sable, too, felt the storm's teeth. On the first night, she left at dusk, disappearing into the woods as she always did. But by morning, she hadn't returned. Michael tried not to panic. He told himself the bobcat knew how to survive in winter, that she'd weathered worse, that wild animals didn't need the comforts of home. But as the hours ticked by and the wind howled louder, even Cooper grew restless, whining at the door and scanning the snowy horizon for any sign of their wild companion. Eli took it hardest. He pressed his face to the frosty barn window, watching the snow swirl and drift, waiting for a glimpse of Sable's shadow. "Do you think she's okay, Dad?" he whispered. Michael wrapped his arms around his son. "I hope so, Bud. Sable's strong. She's survived out there her whole life. She knows how to take care of herself." But the truth was, Michael was scared. He saw the way the kittens grew weaker, their mewling softer each morning. Even Cooper looked thin, eyes rimmed with worry, as if he too understood how much hung in the balance. Food ran low, water froze solid in the buckets each night. It became a ritual. Every few hours, Michael and Eli would trek through knee-deep snow to fetch water, warm blankets, whatever comfort they could muster. By the third day, hope started to fray. One of Sable's kittens, the smallest, stopped eating, curling up beneath Cooper's tail as if trying to hide from the cold. Michael did what he could, tucked the tiny body into his shirt for warmth, fed him drops of milk from a soaked rag, but the kitten barely stirred. The puppies fared a little better, thick fur and dogged optimism keeping them playful, but even they moved less, huddling together for warmth. The barn, usually alive with noise and motion, grew silent but for the sound of wind and the occasional heart-wrenching whimper. Michael knew the odds. Nature rarely showed mercy, and wildness, for all its beauty, often meant loss. He tried not to let Eli see his fear. Instead, he spoke of hope, of how the snow would melt, of how Sable would return with the spring thaw, of how miracles sometimes found their way through even the fiercest storms. On the fourth night, as the blizzard raged outside, Michael found Eli asleep beside Cooper, one arm around a shivering puppy, the other cradling a kitten. Michael tucked an extra quilt over them, brushing hair from his son's forehead. "Hang in there, buddy," he whispered. "We're all in this together." He sat beside them, staring into the dark, listening to the wind batter the barn. Every sound, every creak of the rafters, every scuttle of the snow, made his heart jump. And still, no sign of Sable. But then, just before dawn, on the fifth day, something changed. Cooper, who had hardly moved in hours, suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked, nose working the air. A second later, Michael heard it too. A faint scratching at the barn door, almost lost in the storm. He rushed to the door, heart in his throat, and threw it open. There, battered but alive, stood Sable. Her fur was caked with ice, blood matted one ear, and her sides heaved with exhaustion. But in her jaws, she carried a dead rabbit, and her eyes, though rimmed with fatigue, burned with determination. She staggered inside, collapsing in the hay as Cooper rushed to her side. Michael knelt, tears freezing on his cheeks, helping her settle the rabbit near her kittens. Eli woke, blinking in disbelief, and crawled over, his face splitting into a smile so wide it broke the tension in the air. "Sable! She's back! She's really back!" Sable lifted her head, and for the first time allowed Cooper to touch her without flinching. The old retriever nosed her side, then curled around her, offering his warmth. The kittens, sensing their mother's return, began to stir, one after another lifting their heads, mewing, moving toward her milk. Even the smallest, who had seemed lost, found the strength to nurse, tiny paws kneading at her belly. Michael sat back, relief flooding through him, laughter and tears mingling in the lamplight. The family, wild and tame alike, huddled together for warmth, surviving not because they were the same, but because they had chosen to face the storm side by side. That day, as the storm finally broke and sunlight spilled through the barn window, Michael and Eli celebrated survival. They fed the animals, cleaned the hay, and let Cooper and Sable rest. The neighbors would talk, the world would keep spinning, but in that little barn, something rare and unbreakable had taken root. Sable never quite became tame. She never let Michael touch her, never purred like a house cat, never stayed for long after her kittens grew strong again. But she accepted Cooper, allowed him to nuzzle her and the kittens, a silent acknowledgement of the peace they'd found together. As the sun set, Michael watched his son play with the puppies and kittens, Sable and Cooper lying side by side. He realized that survival had little to do with blood, and everything to do with trust, a lesson the storm had driven home, one cold, miraculous night at a time. Time has a way of slipping past quietly when life is full. Weeks melted into months, and the worst of winter receded into memory, leaving behind the kind of spring that felt like a promise. In the barn, everything changed, and nothing did. The snow outside was replaced by wildflowers and green shoots, and the air grew sweet with the scent of fresh hay and earth. The kittens and puppies grew, sturdy legs and bigger appetites, bright eyes curious about every corner of the world. Some of Sable's kittens, as wildness dictated, grew more distant as the days lengthened. Michael watched them with a mixture of pride and sadness as, one by one, the most adventurous slipped out of the barn for longer and longer forays into the woods. Eventually, two simply didn't return, drawn by some call only they could hear. It was a hard lesson for Eli, but a necessary one. "It's what wild things do, Bud," Michael told him gently, kneeling beside him as they watched the tree line for hours. "They don't always stay, even when we wish they would." Eli tried to be brave, blinking away tears. He was growing up too, and Michael could see in his son's face a deep understanding, the kind of wisdom born not from books, but from living through the heartbreak and joy of loving something you cannot keep. But two stayed behind. Ash, the smallest and boldest of Sable's kittens, refused to stray too far from the barn. He had bonded with Finn, the runt of Cooper's litter, in a way that defied reason and nature. Wherever Finn went, Ash followed, their games a blend of pouncing and chasing, gentle wrestling, and afternoon naps tangled together in shafts of sunlight. They shared food, warmth, and the kind of friendship that didn't care about differences. Neighbors who visited the barn could hardly believe it. A bobcat kitten and a farm puppy, growing up as brothers. It became a legend in Morgan's Hollow, a story parents told their children. Teachers whispered to classes. Some folks thought it a miracle, others a fluke, but Michael saw it for what it was. The beautiful, simple truth that love, real love, didn't ask questions about where you belonged. Sable returned only rarely now. Sometimes at dusk, Michael or Eli would spot her slender shape along the edge of the woods, eyes catching the last red light. She would watch them for a while, motionless, then slip away, silent as always. But every visit, she'd pause by the barn, never entering, never staying long, checking on Ash, watching Finn and Cooper, reminding everyone that her wildness would always remain, just out of reach. Michael found himself reflecting on all that had changed. The barn, once haunted by loneliness and grief, had become a place of learning, a living classroom where boundaries were tested and rewritten, where family meant more than just blood. He saw it in Cooper, who moved more slowly now but watched over Finn and Ash with undiminished devotion. He saw it in Eli, who had learned to let go when necessary and to hold tight when it mattered. One quiet afternoon, Michael stood at the fence, gazing out over the fields as Finn and Ash tumbled in the grass. Eli joined him, silent for a while before finally speaking. "Do you think Ash will ever leave Dad, like the others?" Michael considered this, weighing his words. "He might, buddy. He's got wild in him. But sometimes, even wild things find a place that feels like home. And if he goes, he'll always know he can come back." Eli nodded, understanding more than his years suggested. "I think Finn would miss him a lot." "I think you're right," Michael said, ruffling his son's hair. "But that's the risk with loving anyone, animal or person. Sometimes you get to keep them for a while. Sometimes you just get to help them on their way." That evening, after chores were done, the family, such as it was, gathered on the porch. Cooper rested his head on Eli's feet, while Finn sprawled between Ash and the boy, all of them drowsy in the golden hour. Michael told stories about the barn, about his own childhood, about the mother who had taught Eli to love fiercely and let go gently. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt not the ache of what he'd lost, but the warmth of what he'd gained. He found himself thinking about the boundaries that had once seemed so permanent, the invisible lines between wild and tame, between sorrow and hope, between yesterday and tomorrow. The Bobcat had taught him that trust could change those boundaries, redraw the map of your life when you least expected it. Looking at Finn and Ash, dog and Bobcat, neither fully wild nor fully domestic, Michael understood, at last, the gift he'd been given. Family, he realized, was built not just on blood or even on time, but on care, patience, and the willingness to trust. Sometimes, what's wild teaches us more about love than what's tame ever could. As dusk settled and fireflies began to flicker over the fields, Michael felt Sable's presence on the wind, a watchful spirit never far away. The barn glowed softly, full of life and memory, echoing with the laughter of a boy, the bark of a dog, and the silent promise that love, however unexpected, would always find a way. Years have a way of passing quietly on a piece of land, the seasons tumbling one over the next like so many waves against the shore. On the Harris farm, the barn remained, a little older, a little more battered, but still the beating heart of everything that mattered. Time had carried away much of what was, but it also left behind a kind of peace, woven from the days and nights when wildness and home had learned to share the same space. Finn and Ash grew up together, astonishing every person who set foot on the property. The puppy had become a broad-shouldered dog, golden fur threaded with white, his gentle eyes always watching the edge of the woods. Ash, sleek and silent, moved with the grace of a wild thing, but never strayed far from Finn's side. Their bond, unbroken by the years, became a kind of legend, proof that even nature's rules could bend to make room for something new. Visitors came from all over to see them, local school children, reporters with notepads, even scientists curious about the impossible friendship. Michael welcomed them all, standing on the porch or by the barn doors, always ready to share the story. He told it not as a fairy tale, but as a lesson, a true account of what happens when fear gives way to trust, and when people open their hearts to what they don't understand. He'd learned how to tell the story well. Sometimes he would bring out old photographs, puppies and kittens tumbled together in a heap, Sable's yellow eyes peering from the shadows, Cooper sleeping among the young. He would talk about that winter blizzard, about the storm that almost broke them, and the night Sable returned, battered but unbowed, to save her family. He'd describe how trust had to be earned, every day, and how quickly it could vanish if you stopped tending to it. At school assemblies and town meetings, Michael became an advocate for wildlife coexistence. He spoke of boundaries, not just the ones on maps, but the invisible lines we draw between us and them, between wild and tame, fear and compassion. He taught kids to watch the woods, to listen for the subtle differences in birdsong, to respect every living thing's right to its own place in the world. Eli grew up alongside Finn and Ash, and his childhood became something the other kids envied. He learned patience and humility from the animals, responsibility from caring for them, and courage from watching his father stand up to fear and ignorance. By the time he reached high school, Eli could recite every chapter of the barn's story, his eyes shining with the memory of days spent tangled in sunlight and fur, nights spent waiting for Sable's shadow at the edge of the trees. Sable herself was seen less and less as the years passed. Sometimes at dusk, Michael would spot her watching from the shadows, just beyond the barnyard's reach. She never came closer, never stayed for more than a few heartbeats. But every time he saw her, Michael felt a quiet gratitude. She was proof that wildness could survive alongside love, that some distances are necessary, but none are truly insurmountable if you lead with understanding. The barn's legacy reached beyond just one family. Neighbors began to see bobcats not as threats, but as part of the land's story, worthy of respect and awe. The sheriff, once a regular presence with wildlife officers in tow, came by only to drink coffee and chat about town business. Folks who had once worried about danger now spoke with pride about the miracle on the Harris farm, their own fears softened by time and familiarity. In quiet moments, Michael would reflect on all the ways his life had changed. The grief that had threatened to drown him after Mary's passing had found an outlet in caring for something fragile and wild. The work of raising Eli, of keeping the farm running, of making peace with loss, all of it had been transformed by the lesson the animals taught him, that family is not always what you expect, and love is most powerful where it is least likely. One evening, as twilight deepened and the first fireflies blinked above the tall grass, Michael sat on the barn steps with Eli beside him. Finn lay at their feet, Ash perched elegantly on a rafter overhead. The world was quiet but for the crickets and the slow creak of the barn settling into the night. Eli nudged his father. "Do you think it could happen again? Something this crazy, this special?" Michael smiled, feeling the weight of the years settle into something softer. "I think the world's always ready to surprise us if we let it. We just have to notice." They sat in silence, watching as Finn and Ash settled down together. Two silhouettes, dog and bobcat, etched against the last colors of the sky. Michael thought about all the visitors, all the children who had come and gone, all the ways the barn had changed lives just by holding space for the unexpected. He turned to Eli, voice gentle. "What we built here, it isn't just ours. It belongs to anyone who's willing to look past fear and see what's possible. That's the real legacy, son." As darkness gathered, Michael knew the story would live on. In the laughter of children playing by the barn, in the lessons passed down in classrooms, in the soft footfalls of a wild bobcat watching over her unlikely family. In the end, the barn had become more than a shelter. It was a testament to trust, a reminder that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose and the ones that choose us. And so, as the last light faded, Cooper's legacy, Sable's wild wisdom, Finn's loyalty, and Ash's fierce love lingered on, a bond wilder than blood, a lesson for all who were willing to learn.